Hi, this is the Future of Analytics with Marshall Sponder. I am a author and a writer who and an analyst who was giving this presentation. This is a recap of what we did in Montreal a couple of days ago, and it's called the Future of Analytics. So we know that we're really drinking from the social media fire hose, and obviously you can see that there's so much data out there that um, and a lot of it's unstructured data. But we don't actually need to listen to all of it. And perhaps we actually need to know what we're listening for. I mean, when we go and filter the ocean, we often have a very specific idea of what we want to get out of the ocean in terms of salts and chemicals and so on. And it may very well be that we need to have that kind of information beforehand before we listen to the ocean here. Um, but the internet is teeming with abundant and predictive signals. We see an example here of the success of a box office results. We see some political signals. We have a lot of possibilities where there is actually the internet is abundantly full with predictive signals, and we have only but to really understand how to look at these things. As you see, the fortune teller is looking at the predictive signals in her crystal ball. But we have to kind of go beyond listening and reinventing the idea of what we're listening to. For one thing, do we need to hear everything out there? And if someone else hears it, does it mean that, and we didn't hear it, does it mean that, oh my God, we didn't hear it, but someone does? Does that mean we have to be concerned about that? Or do we need to act on everything that we hear? I think there's a lot of things that we have tried to do here with listening to data, and in a lot of cases we need again to know what we're listening for. And in that, people using going about it the right or the wrong way, because I think that it's likely that people might be going about it the wrong way, and they might not use the right solutions. In my opinion, I wrote a book about it. I did a bit of research about that. So why would you use listening as a use case? I mean, why does anyone even bother to listen? Because actually there's quite a lot of work involved in listening to everything that's going on out there. It's like going into a mall and recording everything that people are saying throughout the entire shopping mall. Can you imagine what kind of intelligence you get out of that, and how much work it might be to disentangle that? And how about listening to an entire city and everything that's going on in the city? I know the Department of Defense and Homeland Security does these kinds of things, but can you really imagine what kind of work might be involved in that, and how you would disambiguate the signal from the noise? As a matter of fact, someone here, in this case, Brandon Johnson from, I think it's The Guardian, was saying the problem with social is that there's so much data. There's 40 or 50 data points that you can measure. Not everything's important, and these are just like metrics measurements. They're not actually KPIs or key performance indicators, or things that might be meaningful, or derivative metrics that are customized for your business, such as say we can make up a couple of these kinds of things, like if you're an architect, how uniform the color is of your facade, the building. I mean, there might be a metric for that, or there might be a metric uh, for green energy. There might be a metric of how many kilowatts per hour that you're able to save. These are things that are very specific to a business use case. Um, but even so, I mean, the metrics that come out of these packages, one can argue that they might not be very particularly relevant in a lot of cases. And the next steps in business intelligence. I mean, let's talk about, if you want to do something with this information, what would be the next steps? This slide originally came from the Recorded Future presentation that I did in early February of 2012, where Chris Annenberg was the co-founder of Recorded Future, is basically saying, and computer scientist, that for 50 years up until 2010, business intelligence was the same thing as enterprise data reporting. Business intelligence it was being done, but it was being done by companies in corporate silos. It was being done for the Department of Defense, and it was being done for the financials. And most of the time, what you got out of these platforms were dashboards that were created, for business intelligence, such as What If. Um, but with the advent of social, I think what you're getting is that the entire social stream is becoming business intelligence. You got Facebook in there. You've got a lot of unstructured data, and now you've got Google. So, and now you also have the idea that as you're trying to listen to all of this information, you're seeing that it's populating into dashboards like Radian 6. Um, but the streamlined intelligence that you might be expecting isn't there. Like if I'm drowning in data and documents from the internet and I need actionable insights, because the data is unstructured and you're listening across the internet and you're focused on keyword matches, you're basically getting some brand mentions and you're getting some insights, but they're not really leading to anything in a lot of cases, because the information's not tactical. It's not actionable in a lot of cases. You can't do anything with it, and if you need to listen to a lot of stuff, you may have to keep on throwing more people at it. You can't easily scale that, and it's often too expensive to do well, and it's hard work to do. Sort of like digging for gold in California in streams of little sifters. Not easy to do, and that's a lot of pain. So what do you do? Well, what do we have to do? What are we stuck with here? I mean, what's the problem in any rate of even doing this stuff at all? And I think what you're seeing is a signal to noise ratio that's very, very high. It's just a lot of noise and more noise than signal, and very hard to filter out just the signal. It's not scalable. It's not easy to do, to just throw 2 or 3 people at it and take care of everything. It's tough to get hands around. It's interesting, but there's not that much you can do with it. And I think a lot of businesses are waking up to that and asking for more. And also while there's more of a geolocation component involved, there's still very poor geography and location capabilities that are just beginning to come online. And therefore, as a result, a lot of things that are being said about a business or an organization locally aren't being picked up because the information isn't fully captured. And platforms don't have that segmentation capability that the business objects software had from 1960 to 2010. Also, correspondence between online chatter and offline word of mouth is fairly industry independent, and meaning, I guess what I'm saying with that is that a lot of times there isn't a hell of a lot of chatter about certain subjects, and there's a lot of chatter about other subjects, and it's not all equalized out. If you take 2 industries such as automotive and cosmetics, as a recent study was done last year, to show if there was correspondence, it turns out there's a lot for automotive, as you can imagine, because there's a lot of advertising and a lot of people feel passionately about the cars. Not so much about cosmetics, almost none. So if you're Ford or General Motors, wow, that's great. You can find out a lot about your brand in social media. On the other hand, if you're Proactive or Clarisol, it's one, not at all, almost. People just aren't talking. If you're a dishwashing detergent brand, Finish or Cascade, forget it. No one's talking. Or if they are talking, it's like all coupon generated stuff. So it's not very particularly valuable. And also, there's no way to really look at this stuff, no standards. So these are what I consider to be 8 challenges. And along with that, there's this problem of just having too much massive amounts of data to read. I mean, you can't read all this data. Like you can see, it's going up here. I have this little animation. It's just too much to read. You can't read it. You can't scale it. There's no process involved with it. Your success signals are undefined. You have to define them. It's all unstructured for the most part. It's time consuming to wade through, and like I said earlier, read. And it's you can't scale it. Not the way it is today. You have to keep on throwing more and more bodies, and it gets harder and harder as more bodies and the more instances of listening you're doing of the same thing. The harder it gets to wade through. You just get more data, and especially when you're starting at this stuff, you might just not even know where to start. And this is all what we face with social. I think one of the problems with social that is a real problem is that this kind of idea of a lens approach of constructing what we call Boolean queries and saved data sets just doesn't work too well for online listening. I think that probably around 100 years ago or more, this idea of Boolean algebra got created out of a genetics experiment where you had ands, nots, and buts, and 1 plus 1 equal 1, or 1 plus 0 equal 1, 0 plus 1 equal 1, whatever. It led to the idea of on and off state theory, solid state conductors, and the idea that you could have something plus something equals something, or something this and this. The idea of Boolean operators, worked well when your value was 1 or 0, on or off. The problem is that Boolean queries are not discrete values of 1 and 0. They're often something, a descriptive sentence about, or word or phrase about something, and a phrase about something else, or give me this and this phrase but not this one, or give me everything with this in except if it has any of this other thing in it, don't give it to me. Give me everything about orange but not anything of orange peel or orange juice. The problem is that we're not working with ones and zeros. We're working with very kind of unstructured, loose descriptions by a lot of different people about their daily activities and their opinions, and trying to create a lens for it doesn't work so well, because the way people describe what they do and what they think and how they behave and what they want is often almost impossible to really write well in a query. And there's all different problems with even writing long queries. You can only write a query for most of the platforms that are out there that are 1,000 characters or so. So you can't really even write and put in a query. And if you're a back-end computer scientist on one of these systems, you can probably write very long queries, but hardly anyone works on the back end of these products, and they're not really designed. They're designed more for people that don't know what they're looking for. So in trying to construct what they think is a query, doesn't actually work so well. And one example of that is in this slide here. What I have is a video on YouTube of a used car that's being sold by a dealership in Rhode Island. It came out of political listening use case. We were looking for topics in Rhode Island that were of interest to a particular candidate or candidates. And the Boolean query here is fairly long and has nearness operators. But what we ended up picking up, among other things, was let's say the net we cast. We picked up this, which was an ad for a car with a out of Radian 6 that had a transcript that was robotically read out, and in that transcript there was the push marketing around foreclosures. So we were basically more and more finding that marketing and black hat SEO, if we want to call it that, was infiltrating into listening and making it and polluting it to the point where trying to cancel out this kind of effect is almost impossible, because you'd have to know it's there in the first case, and you'd have to know how to cancel it out. And that's not possible to do, partly because there are people that are making their living doing this kind of stuff. And so, and constantly changing it and trying to figure out what Google and Yahoo and everybody else is doing. So with that, we go into the best solutions designs, like what are the 20 plus issues or profiles or permutations that you need to do in order to um, make this work. I mean, in the case of the Rhode Island race that we're looking at currently, um, there are several issues. I counted just 20 plus issues, and depending on what platforms you're using, this could actually be quite expensive, because depending on how you want to design your listening and how granular you want to get, you can actually turn this into a $50,000 a month project. I'm not saying it has to be that, but because of the way that these platforms are designed, they don't actually lend themselves to very elegant solutions. And as a result, we don't get that pie in the sky we were told we were going to get out of these platforms, because they don't actually do what they sound like they do so well. And so the new solutions actually lie in adding additional dimensions to the data, for example, place and time. They could include adding custom taxonomies and lexicons and data mashups. That's particularly true of projects like for pharmaceuticals or financials. For example, if you're looking for phases of drug, of a behavioral type of activity that doesn't really lend itself so well to listening, but where there are signals where someone's at stage 1 of their patient journey or stage 2, if the taxonomy were really, really customized well enough and comprehensive enough, and it's possible that you could pick up a stage 1 in a category and a stage 2 of a particular drug in a way that researchers might get something out of that. But it would be a lot of work, and it's certainly not something that most of these platforms do without a bit of customization. And that's just generally something that people aren't yet really cognizant of, and that's part of the reason why I'm out there speaking. You can also really come up with better and new solutions by really looking very closely at where you're listening. And this doesn't work for everything, but for most things in social it does. If you figure out the authoritative sources to listen to, you can just listen to those sources. Where it doesn't work is with PR and crisis management, where you don't necessarily know where something you need to pay attention coming from. But for almost any other use case of social, customizing your data, where it's coming from, and selecting who and what to listen to is important. And of course, taking the data out of those data feeds and properly extracting a lot of the navigational elements and advertising out of it, and aggregation out of it is really important, and often not done well. And also, you need to know what you're doing this for. You need to know what your goals are. So, and we'll cover that later in the slide deck. And in order to define what, when, and how you're going to accomplish those goals, so you need to actually put some definition around not only the goals, but how you're going to do these goals, and where you're going to do these goals, and what you're going to be looking for to decide that you've got to where you want to go. And that's the key performance indicators that tell you that. So, okay. In this part of the presentation, we're actually talking about a couple of different solutions I've worked with. I haven't, there's just zillions of things out there, and I get shown quite a few things, but I don't, I haven't tried everything out there, so I'm not going to really speak to everything that's possibly out there. I'm just going to talk about a couple that I've worked with that I think are pretty good, that solve part of the issues that we're talking about so far in the last 20 minutes. And as you see here is a picture of Asgard and the Rainbow Bridge. So it's something we're all striving to. If you've seen the Avengers uh, recently out, you can see that we've got um, Thor and Captain America and just the whole saving the world from Loki and the invading uh, aliens. But anyway, just to get back to if anyone here is a comic fan, you probably can relate to this. Um, I don't know which one of these characters you like the most. There could be five different. Actually, you could take every different character here and say it's a different use case of social media, and probably brute force is the Hulk wins out. Targeted thing, you've got Hawkeye there. Captain America, that's the PR front. You've got to be right. Thor, I don't know. Uh, Iron Man is the self-made company, and that like Blender Tech or something like that. And Black Widow, I don't know. Maybe the CIA and the government listening. Anyway, one of the solutions that I came across of that does solve some of these problems is a recorded future, and some of the presentation, the next couple of slides, really maybe the next 10, come from largely a presentation that Recorded Future, Chris Annenberg and Chris Holden and myself gave in February of 2012, that I've adapted and somewhat prettied up and taken from somewhat freely. The Recorded Future is a platform, it's a temporal platform that tries to take events that and put them on a timeline. The one of the papers that Recorded Future put out likened their analytics platform to Plato's cave and said that they were looking for the fundamental reality behind what the events were. So I took this image from Plato's cave out of Wikipedia. Recorded Future likens general social listening to like shadows being cast on the wall. Similarly, like Plato, there's this cave here, that the real truth is more from the figures behind the fires. So that they're allegorically saying they're identifying these people who are casting the shadow, and that's more important. And I would tend to agree with that. I think any closer to the fire, to the source of the light, is probably where you're going to get it, depending on where you are in this cave. And as we could see, the web is full of events, but the problem with the events is that they are there's number of ways to cut up things on the web. And one of the things is by when they happened and where they happened, but mostly when they happened and when they will maybe happen. Because I think in a previous slide what you saw is that they could be happening sometime. So from keywords to timelines, record what the world knows about the future. It's what the Recorded Future is done. So it's taking a lot of the data out there and trying to organize it by when it's going to happen and when it happened based on what people said. And it's kind of different than what Google's doing. I mean, Google is organizing the data as a question and answer. They are trying to do some of the stuff. And as in fact, Google is an investor in Recorded Future, as is the CIA's own Inqutel. But Google doesn't really answer so much the questions of when. Like what's happening in Baghdad next week? Well, I actually did that query, and I used an operator of the last 24 hours, and I got some things about UN inspectors on the top results. But if I do that with Recorded Future, I actually get a topic map, influencer. I get a bunch of aggregation into different entities here: person, places, companies, organization. In other words, it's quite a bit more defined. And now with the recent addition of Google Maps mashups, you can actually look at these things from a geographic point of view. You can see where the hotspots are over the regions, and you can actually click on those things and get the verbatims, as I'm doing here, for persons that Turkey is exporting massive quantities of gold to Iran and Arab nations. And also, Iran wants nuclear success. I mean, it's interesting. I think this kind of approach actually works better with a customized data feed than it does with the web, but I think that, I think it shows a lot of promise that they're trying to do this, and it does get a lot more intelligence out of this data if you want to take the dimension of time into it. Here's Montreal, where I was earlier this week giving a presentation quickly. Um, in this case, I didn't actually see that much that had anything to do with the conference I was at, but I did get some information about Montreal. And so these platforms are improving. I mean, if you look at the architecture of the recorded future, it actually takes 70,000 plus real-time sources, and it structures that into facts and time. And they have an API as well as an online tool. One of the things we looked at was the recorded future temporal timeline. It's different than what Google can actually do or what anybody else pretty much does. Here's an example of Kindle Fire in the iPad that shows the next year or so. What people say is going to happen. It's very useful for analysts of various types that might want to decide what might be happening in the future. Also, there's another one on mobile and tablets in the next 3 years. I think the calling points for this one were actually created by Chris Holden at Recorded Futures, a community manager. We derived out of intelligence that most 3/4 of businesses plan on deploying tablets by 2013, according to what they say they're going to do, based on what Recorded Future has picked up. That's going to affect online healthcare, and it's going to affect a lot of things, and it's disrupt software engineering and user expectations because you're going to have to redesign the software to work well with tablets. Very well. And we go back here. Venue Labs does, in fact, give you additional insights if you can get the place. A lot of times people check in or talk about a place, but they don't actually mention the place. Like, they just mess up a lot. If I weren't in a rush or a coffee addict, I would go somewhere else, but you don't know where that is. And it actually turns out that to be a Starbucks. There's a lot of things that are being said about businesses and organizations and companies and that aren't specifically referencing those companies, but because you can determine if you can determine where they're happening, you can actually put that context in, and then it becomes a brand monitoring issue. Venue Labs is a company out in Washington State that does a lot of storefront analytics. I actually have an instance of New York Art, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And Venue Labs claims that in a lot of cases, there's a good 70% of the data out there about a brand is ultraviolet, basically, which is a term it's out there. People are saying here again, they mess up a lot, and if it weren't a rush or a coffee addict, I would go somewhere else, but they didn't mention Starbucks, so the particular Starbucks. See, that's important for Starbucks to know, but it wouldn't have been picked up by just looking at the Foursquare check-in if they didn't have the location of the check-in, and if that were pushed out to Twitter, which it often is, it wouldn't be picked up either. There'd be a little URL next to it, but unless the instrumentation or listening platform actually took that data and reversed and put it into the location and figured out where it was, which it doesn't do most of the time, you wouldn't be able to get that information, and so you wouldn't really be able to segment it on it either, because the platforms aren't generally designed to do that. So that's another problem. And then here's an example of the New York Art instance I just referred to. This is a Venue Labs instance that monitors all the art museums that, for the most part, that I've looking at New York City. And it's looking at the biggest fans, biggest critics, the loudest voices across all of these. It's looking at the positive and negative sentiment. It's looking at this across channels. And in this case, for example, what are the most active from a standpoint of check-ins and comments about a place? Which are the most active? And it's MoMA, the Metropolitan Museum, and Guggenheim, most active. You can get detailed stats on the number of check-ins and the number of messages, and you can get sentiment and number of reviews in every place. Like American Museum of Natural History, it's like 320,000 check-ins almost as the time I did this. It varies. I mean, you can look at the number of check-ins and sort it by that. A slide, you see the Metropolitan Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum are the, sorry about the sirens in the background, most visited Museum of Modern Art. These are the people, these are the websites that, and the Tate. These are the ones, the top four, okay? But if you look at the most visited museums in foot traffic, the Louvre and the British Museum get more. The Met comes in number 3. I mean, we're not really talking about necessarily the same audiences or the same people. But what we're seeing is that online and offline, again, don't actually always correspond. If we look at what people are doing in Facebook and Twitter, MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York, seems to be the dominant in both channels. But Facebook comes in second for Museum of Modern Art, for Metropolitan. But on Twitter, Saatchi Gallery comes in. And actually, you could say the Metropolitan isn't as strong on Twitter as it is on Facebook, which is something for them to look at. Because it's certainly, it may be a reflection more of how they hire community managers than anything else. But that's something they need to consider. And then also you need to look at the most engaging content itself. And you can do that in Museum Analytics. And here you can see a lot of it's going to be based around people who are, in this case, Dali's birthday was happening and last week. So, you have basically those things that are being picked up, and Twitter pretty much reflects the same thing. And then now let's look at one of the last things. If you want to collect, another way to add context is connecting things together, like online and offline. Again, not so easy to do. Connecting engagement to conversions. This is a platform called Campalist. They're good friends of mine, and I'm going to be doing a webinar with them in a month or two. They basically have found a way to connect the offline, if you want to consider it, the actual posts that generate a transaction or a goal in your analytics, if in fact you can get to that. They can certainly do something that Google doesn't do. Here's an example of, I wrote a post last month about Google gunning for HubSpot. It generated 10 visits, but when I look at Google Analytics, what I get, if you look here, is just I can look at my post, but what I really get is a t.co shortened URL link, and not really at all what I did. It doesn't tell me much about who actually generated this traffic and what they did. So I don't have that context. I just know that the post I did. Campalist does that. It also is able to rank the people that are most generating, visits and conversions. If I have that set up in my analytics and I have some sort of dollar value to it, actually kind of show the value of those things. So this is at least as much as I've set it up. But it also can, if I actually sold white papers on my website, this is all my website now, and I had my analytics properly set up for that, I would actually show who is responsible for sales of my paper, who've brought referrals back to me by their tweeting or posting on Facebook and Twitter. And the issue there then becomes, is Campalist basically affiliate marketing tracking platform? And it may be for social. Maybe it is. Maybe if you treat the whole stream as a bunch of people that are potential affiliates but haven't entered an affiliate relationship formally. This would be closer to the truth what Campbellist is actually doing. Um, Certainly it can rank people who are talking about you based on their posts and who they are, based on clout, or based on followers or goal value or revenue and visits, and it keeps on getting better and better. So I want to finish off the presentation with what we need to do with these tools, because we need to do something with them. Otherwise, they're not that useful. And one of the things I've come to is an objective strategy, tactic plan that I found a couple of years ago. This idea of creating strategies and goals and tactics and programs and so on that can be likened to building a structure, like a temple here, like the Pantheon. And one of the things that came with this article that I read was that there was a sample plan here where you had a goal, an audience, location, time. If you read down this thing, you'll see that it's easy. I teach at Rutgers and University of California Irvine Extension, and I've integrated these things here, and I've gotten a couple examples of what students have done with it. For example, this this particular student's a musician, and he wanted to resurrect George Enescu's work. He's a famous Romanian composer who was very popular in his life, but not particularly well known now. He has a couple of rhapsodies that people listen to, but other than that, is most of the rest of the stuff. He had well-known people studying with him, including Toscanini and other people. He was very revered in his life, but not particularly that much well played anymore. So his goal was to, he defined the audience and defined his site, time, and the way he was going to do it, and what he was going to put forth, and what the program was, and he put the key performance indicators, which were different than the goals. They were the definition. Because the goal here was to salvage the reputation of the Romanian 20th century composer, and the metrics were the key performance indicators to decide that were popularity of Google Trends, new business connections and partnerships, new visitors to the website, and YouTube statistics. I think the only thing we could have added is thresholds, like if you wanted to take some action, how many new business connections do you need? How many new visitors to the websites? What kind of YouTube statistics would you need to know this was success? So the targets weren't defined, but I didn't ask them to do that. Another example was a student who increased the soccer video blog visits, and he liked to play online soccer, so he was talking about a site and how he's going to do that, and how he would know, and how many retweets and video views. Again, he didn't have many visits to his site, so we didn't really have much there. And then the final example here is just getting exposure from one's work, from one's artwork. These were a class of artists, basically, photographers and musicians and various people in the arts, and increase the artwork, get name exposure through the art community. In the studio, this was at Rutgers, so the one thing that was missing here is a call to action. I think that this particular artist didn't really have a compelling argument for looking at their work, something that they should have had, and which the course actually did talk about, because that's something that people ought to have. But when you put this in the structure, you had an idea. So anyway, I just want to finish up with the summary here, that the future of analytics is with actionable data. You need, the reason why we get these tools and the reason why we do any of this stuff, and we look at data in the first place, is to get something to do with the data. But the data itself, a lot of times, isn't actionable because it's unstructured, or it's not normalized, or it's got a lot of garbage and stuff in it that you need to clean up. And one way of doing that is by adding conditional context. You can add contextual information. We looked at time and place. We looked at connecting offline and online in meaningful ways to your business. And then you need the plan, the right one, to execute, to be able to do this. And that's the whole plan and the goals and the key performance indicators all together, mapping it out like I just gave you a couple examples of. And that's pretty much what you need to do. And with that, my presentation is closed. I'm happy to answer any questions that people follow up with me in the future about this. And thanks for coming and listening to this. Cheers. It's Marshall Sponder for Webmetrics Guru Incorporated. Bye. And that's the end of the recording.